Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing the film My Dead Friend Zoe. Briefly, the film follows Merritt, a US veteran who is haunted by her best friend Zoe. I strongly suggest you watch this film without any spoilers or prior information because I did not know what to expect going in, and there's an emotional punch that occurs at the end of the film that literally will bring you to tears. The film builds up very slowly and naturally, and so when this emotional impact occurs, it really does take you by surprise. With that being said, you have been warned. Starting with what I liked, most of the film revolves around Merritt and her interactions with Zoe's ghost. The circumstances of Zoe's death are gradually unpacked through flashbacks throughout the film. I felt the film was very effective in building up to the climax because as a viewer, you automatically assume what could have happened, but what actually happens is totally unexpected. Merritt and Zoe meet in the army, and although they come from very different walks of life, they enlist to start the process of figuring out what they want to do with their lives. The conflict begins when Merritt applies for college, leaving Zoe behind. And I think the movie does such a great job of unpacking the pros and cons of military service through Zoe and Merritt's interactions and conversations. For a lot of Americans, the military is one of the only avenues for a potentially better life, not just in terms of access to education and resources, but in terms of community and friendship. In the military, Zoe and Merritt pretty much spend all their time together, and this is not really a bond they're able to recreate in the real world. And the proximity, both physically and emotionally, continues even after Zoe's death. One point that is constantly emphasized throughout the film is how great Merritt is at fixing things. She prides herself on being able to put anything back together again. Unfortunately, the one thing she's unable to fix is her relationship to her best friend Zoe. Most of the film follows Merritt long after she leaves the military and also after she loses her best friend. I thought the environment cleverly mirrored Merritt's emotional state. Her apartment feels very claustrophobic. There's books everywhere, dead plants, and all these things that she spends her time fixing or putting together. Merritt's PTSD regarding Zoe's death is so bad that she almost accidentally kills a coworker, forcing her into counseling. I thought the movie did its best to try and remain authentic, casting real veterans. And I think the film could have actually benefited from a longer runtime. Morgan Freeman leads these VA counseling groups, and although he has a lot of intimate conversations with Zoe, it's really not enough, especially when you compare how deep Zoe's relationship is to Merritt. Merritt's relationship to Zoe's ghost takes a turn when she finds out that her grandfather is not doing that well, and she is tasked by her mother to send him to a retirement home. Zoe then builds this kind of budding relationship to the owner of this retirement home. I think a longer runtime would have helped deepen this relationship because all the ingredients are there. They just didn't really have enough time to flesh it out. One of the strengths of this film is Merritt's relationship to her grandfather. I thought Ed Harris was a real gem, and I thought the contrast between her time in the military and her grandfather's really does add more nuance to this conversation regarding the effects war has on a soldier. Her grandfather was enlisted, or should I say forcibly drafted, and his experience coming home was incredibly traumatizing. Many Americans viewed soldiers involved in the Vietnam War as criminals, and her grandfather describes having to remove his uniform in a bathroom to avoid being spit on. They were not greeted at the airport. They really didn't have a lot of avenues to express their frustrations or even voice their experiences. And it really does touch on how the decision to go to war is often made by people the least affected by it. Her grandfather describes how these VA counseling groups were the only space he had to talk about his experiences because no one really wanted to hear it. And Vietnam was obviously a very different type of war. Most people knew someone who was enlisted because of the draft. And when you compare that to something like Afghanistan or Iraq, not as many people were engaged. And even if they were, these soldiers did not receive the level of hatred or pushback that maybe her grandfather did coming home from Vietnam. One of my favorite lines in this film is when Zoe's ghost is screaming at this group, and she states, "We survived the dumbest wars of all time only to sit here broken." Although Merritt and her grandfather are worlds apart, that stigma still exists, this unwillingness to speak about what took place and how this affected you. These conversations are important because it helps us understand the devastating emotional and mental state a war can have on a soldier and also their community coming home. After Zoe's suicide, Merritt goes into this self-isolation. She doesn't really reach out to any friends or family. And this self-isolation nearly kills her. And I think that's what struck me the most about Merritt's character. After she leaves the military, she goes on to live a really nice life. However, that life ends when Zoe dies. This guilt of feeling like she had abandoned her friend is to the point where she even apologizes to Zoe's ghost anytime she leaves her alone. Merritt and Zoe are constantly together. This is now my second warning to you. I'm going to go into more spoilers, so be warned. The constant flashbacks throughout the film make you believe that Zoe and Merritt may have had some altercation that accidentally led to Zoe's death. Instead, what ends up happening is Zoe commits suicide. A lot of Zoe's behavior prior to her death is mirrored by Merritt, who becomes just as isolated as Zoe. And Zoe's character is incredibly well developed because on the outside, she appears to be a very strong and independent woman. But really, she's incredibly lonely, and what she's afraid of has nothing to do with life or death. What she's afraid of is this isolation and this loneliness. It's hard to go from an environment of structure and human interaction to one with none at all. Watching the contrast between Zoe and Merritt's life after the military was really sad. Merritt's guilt stems from having convinced Zoe not to re-enlist, and Merritt totally misinterprets Zoe's desire to re-enlist in the army. And that's the question Zoe keeps asking, like, what else is there? And it really has nothing to do with college or a career. It's more like these interactions that they're having mean so much to Zoe, and it's not something that Merritt really appreciates until Zoe dies. And there's a song, and I thought the soundtrack was actually really effective. In the beginning I wasn't sure, but towards the end I was very sure. There's a song that plays twice, and the second time it plays you want to cry, because it's in that moment you realize how much Merritt meant to Zoe and how much this friendship has been keeping her alive. I like the imagery of Merritt constantly going on these runs, because these runs are the only time she has to forget about Zoe's ghost. And towards the end of the film, she's done running away from her problems and she starts like running towards some type of solution. And the solution lies in community, it lies in VA groups. And luckily for Merritt, she does have her grandfather, she does have her mother. Even before we find out the details of Zoe's death, Merritt mentions how her trauma is not really related to an incident, but to a person. When Merritt comes back to the real world, she doesn't really know what to do with Zoe. And when Zoe comes back to the real world, she doesn't really know what to do with herself. And this inability to kind of bridge these two worlds almost kills both of them. Overall, I thought this was a very tight and thoughtful script. You can tell they edited this movie down, maybe a little too down, but it's definitely worth a watch. And again, that ending, for those of you who stuck around until the end of the review, I mean, I tried to warn you, but I actually ended up having tears in my eyes. Like, I felt really, really sad. Like, the emotional impact, it happened so quietly, and it kind of sneaks up on you, and it's not really something you're expecting. And so overall, I highly recommend this film. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.